What we often experience is that companies make succession planning extremely complicated. And I think quite often that's where HR people have to look at themselves. And we try to do that by jumping in and, you will get the message from CEO, please go and do succession planning, or it's on the agenda for so long we have to do succession planning. And then HR go about and they do the studies, etc., etc. And then they start with all these fancy spreadsheets and they start assessing everyone and they're having career discussions. It sounds familiar. And then you end up with all these Excel spreadsheets and presentations and members of the boards that have to come together. And then you find that after a year actually it falls flat. And then quite often people will ask themselves, but why on earth, where did we go wrong with the process? And personally we often see that companies tend to make that process too difficult for themselves. And why do I say so? First of all, they try to do everything for the whole of company, for the whole of the company. And when you engage in a large company, 20, 30,000 employees or whatever the case may be, you can't implement a succession planning process in a year time for that full company. Just given that specifically if companies start with the road of succession planning, it's not a culture in that particular organization. Management and executives are not used to it. It sounds great and it looks great in terms of paper, and all the other companies are doing that. And all the CEO studies tells us that we have to do that, but the culture is not embedded in the company. So therefore, I think the first point I would like to make is keep it as simple as possible. Start with identifying those critical roles in your company which you would like to take through a succession planning process. Start identifying who are the potential within that particular group. And yes, there are various ways that one can look at potential and define potential, and probably each and every consulting company have got their own definition of what potential is, but at least start in terms of the way of start defining that particular potential. Then have specific plans in place of how one will develop that potential. In other words, prepare people to be ready, and then finally have at some point in time when people are in fact ready to take over and start going into the succession process. There's a lot of positions in organizations where we don't need to have a succession planning process in place. If you think about our administrative type of positions, there's a huge supply of admin people outside there. It's not necessary to have succession planning processes in place for them. So why waste your time in having some fancy spreadsheets to start looking at that? Rather spend your time and energy on developing those people in terms of their own framework, but not necessarily from a succession planning point of view. And focus your energy on your scarce category. Those scarce category that's really going to make a difference in your life, and that's really going to cause you to have sleepless nights. Like for instance the engineers. We know that's a very specific scarce country. Like for instance our leaderships. We know that currently in South Africa we are actually, if we compare against BRICS countries in a recent talent survey that we have published, we are currently okay in terms of comparison. But what about the future? And we see that we have got a very limited supply of future leaders which is now getting ready for us. So we are sitting on a time bomb. And that's the type of areas that we should start addressing. The second point that I would like to make, and you have just addressed on that, is this whole question, but should we get from outside, or should we actually start developing our own people? Now I think once again, yes, by investing in your own people, it sends out a very strong message within your company, within your organization that you are developing from in. However, your biggest challenge that you have to ask yourself, but if we compare from in, if we compare our own people with out there, how do we look? And how do we actually benchmark our people and the effectiveness of our people against our competitors, against our industry? So you have to ask yourself the question, if you think about normal distribution, if you think about the top quarter of a normal distribution, you should have about 25% of your people which lies in the top quarter of performance, of potential, whatever criteria you're measuring. And if you don't have 25% of people falling in that particular category of the top quarter, it means that you are lacking. It means that either you are attracting the wrong people, or it means that you didn't develop your people, or it just means that right from the start, you didn't have the right people in place. And the important question is, how do you compare with your competitors? Do they have more than 25% of people in that top quartile? In other words, your typical high potential. Because if they have, and you don't have, then you're a bit in trouble. And then actually, the argument to say, but we have to develop from inside, is not a valiant argument anymore, because you just don't have that potential inside your company. And then you have to start going and look outside. Yes, if you are in the lucky situation or the best situation, where you do have more than 25% of people in that top quarter, sure, then you can start developing from inside, because then you're in the best position to do that. So, summarize. First point of view is that when one is talking about succession planning, my particular view is that one must make it as simple as possible. You must focus on your critical roles, and you must have a logical process in place, and one must always understand that it is a new thing. Often it's a new thing in organizations. And you must prepare your organization, you must prepare the CEO, you must prepare the board to take them through a process to understand what we want to achieve with succession planning. Otherwise, it becomes a paper exercise with a lot of Excel spreadsheets. And secondly, look at your internal talent. Compare and benchmark your internal talent against your competitors, against norm groups, against whatever the case may be, and then ask yourself, but do I have enough talent in my organization? Can I actually get away with developing my own people, which is great. It sends a strong message back to your organization. But if you don't have that, then you have to go outside, and you have to go and find your people outside.